Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. In this section, we've explored the US foreign policies throughout the 1940s and 50s, which involved going into World War II and the Cold War and the Korean War. We'll cap it off by looking at the career of Joseph McCarthy and the repercussions of the Cold War within the United States itself. So what about this man McCarthy? Let's start by talking about his life. Well, he was from Wisconsin, and he fought in World War II, like many young men from his generation. Specifically, he served in the Pacific. Though not with much bravery, his main achievement was to get his airplane around the local island and then shooting down coconut trees and then trying to get a medal for using a lot of ammunition without specifying that there was no combat involved. And that kind of pay lie set the tone for his later career. Throughout his life, he took a kernel of truth to turn into an actual lie to get some political benefits out of it, and that became a hallmark of his career. After World War II, when he returned to the United States, he entered politics, and successfully so. In 1946, he was able to be elected as a Republican senator from Wisconsin. He actually defeated one of the members of the Lafayette dynasty, and if you listen closely to the lecture, remember that Lafayette used to be a big progressive figure from Wisconsin who ran for president as a progressive in the 1924 election unsuccessfully, and well, the Lafayette that was defeated in 1946 would be his son, I think. The rule is when you become a senator like this, as a first-term senator, you try to lie low, not make any mistake, and hopefully get re-elected in 1952. Except McCarthy did two stupid things. The first one is that he used his connection to get some bribes, and that did not play too well with the good people from Wisconsin. The second thing was even weirder. He defended the Nazis who had been involved in the Malmedy massacre. If you're not familiar with that, the Malmedy massacre took place in Belgium towards the end of World War II, where some Nazis rounded up some American POWs, which normally they should have treated well under the Geneva Conventions, and then instead summarily shot them. So it's a war crime when you shoot POWs. And instead of saying just that, McCarthy for some reason tried to defend the Nazi war criminals, saying, well, in wartime some things like that happen in the heat of the action, or whatever excuse he had. Which is something you never ever want to do as a US politician, to defend Nazis who had killed American POWs. Especially right after World War II, when you have a lot of relatives of POWs and US veterans around. So between this and the whiff of corruption, it was assumed that in 1952, when he would be up for re-election, remember that senators are elected for 6 years, he would be defeated, and it would be just a footnote history that a junior senator from Wisconsin that got one term in office said some stupid things and then went down in defeat. Until in 1950, he was in Wheeling, West Virginia, when he was supposed to deliver some speech about a boring topic. Housing, I think, was the topic, and it was supposed to be to a local club of Republican women. Then he switched the topic to something a bit more engaging. That would be the topic of communist penetration of the US government. And he complained about how communists were on the up and China had gone communist. And to him, the reason was clear. The reason was that there were some traitors within the State Department that were actively helping the enemy, the Soviet Union. The reason why we find ourselves in a position of impotency is not because our only powerful potential enemy has sent men to invade our shores, but rather because of the treacherous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. It's not been the less fortunate or members of minority groups who have been treacherous to this nation, but rather those who have had all the benefits that the wealthiest nation on earth has had to offer: finest homes, finest college education, and the finest jobs in government. This is glaringly true in the State Department. They're the bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouths are the ones who have been the most treacherous. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. End quote. Much earlier in the course, I had talked about the populist movement of the late 19th century. And I told you that even though they were not successful at the polls, they had left a kind of style that became quite common in US political discourse ever since. Something that surfaced again in Louisiana during the governorship of Huey Long, and again under McCarthy. And the hallmarks of that populist movement is that you tend to see the world as a battle between us And them, where the people are always betrayed by some elite few, and where you like to talk about conspiracies, maybe also have a whiff of anti-Semitism, and you're good about using demagoguery, of using political rhetoric to turn truth into something a bit more twisted. And all these you can see in the speech by McCarthy. At any rate, this was a very successful speech. It was picked up everywhere because of its incredible claim in there that 205 people that were sympathetic to the Soviet Union were acting to shape US foreign policy, and that's the reason we had lost China. As it turned out, McCarthy had no evidence. He never gave the list of those 205. And when he was asked about that in the next interview, he said, well, I have a list of 57 people and 133, and the number kept changing, and he never gave the actual list. As it turned out, he never uncovered a single communist spy. It's all baloney to help himself be reelected. And he was given his own committee in the US Senate to conduct hearings and to try to uncover communists active in the US State Department. And if you were summoned to that committee, this was something that was pretty awful. You had to go and have a subpoena against you, and then you are interviewed under an oath, so you have to tell the truth. And then McCarthy would ask you, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And it was difficult to defend yourself. You could tell the truth and say that I was indeed a communist, but it is my right as an American under the First Amendment to have opinions of my own, and this has not influenced my work in the State Department. But in the context of the Cold War, people would look at you as an enemy just by virtue of being a communist. Or you might lie about the fact that you had once been a communist. In that case, you were lying under oath, and that's felony by itself. Or maybe you were never a communist and you tried to explain that, but McCarthy would never believe you. He would say that he has evidence that you were indeed a communist and you were indeed a spy, and you could not quite defend yourself because he was a much better liar than you could ever be. So ultimately, a lot of people would decide to take the Fifth, which is a reference to the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution as part of Bill of Rights. And nowadays, people tend to focus a lot on the Second Amendment for some reason. The Fifth is a far more important one, especially if you are ever accused of a crime. It's a fairly long article, and there are quite a few things to unpack in there, but basically there are the concepts that you cannot be indicted without a grand jury, that when you are sentenced, you have to first be submitted to a due process, that you cannot be tried twice for the same crime, it's called double jeopardy, or that the government cannot confiscate your land unless it's for something very useful like an interstate, that is called eminent domain, or more importantly for us, you shall not be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against yourself. Silent. And you've seen those cop shows where the cop is reading the Miranda rights to the suspect. You have the right to be silent. Everything you say can and will be held against you, and you have the right to access to a lawyer. All that is from the Fifth Amendment, which could come in handy if you ever commit a crime and the police is trying to pressure you into signing a statement. Well, you have the right to say under the Fifth Amendment, I'd rather not. Or even better, don't do anything stupid in the first place and don't get arrested. Anyway, that's what a lot of people did during the hearing. They would take the Fifths, refuse to talk, but then people assumed if you're taking the Fifths, you have something to hide, so you must be guilty after all. Maybe McCarthy is onto something. If you look at footage of McCarthy during his hearings, he comes across as a very unlikable person. He's a bully, he interrupts persons, he lies all the time, and remember that he never uncovered an actual communist spy, so he's so phony as well. So how come for a while in the first few years of the 1950s he was such a big household name that all the other Republicans were afraid of? Not even Eisenhower, the president, a genuine war hero, would dare to speak against him. So why the success? Well, part of it has to do with the context. Just a year before, in 1949, China had gone communist, and people could not understand why this had happened. Well, he had a ready-made answer. It's because people in the State Department had betrayed the United States. Well, that was not the case, but that was the answer he gave. Also in 1949, the Soviet Union had developed the atomic bomb for the first time. And that surprised a lot of people because it was assumed that the Soviet Union was technologically backward and so could not develop the nuclear bomb for many, many years. And the reason must have been espionage, which, as it turned out, was the case. Not only were there good scientists in the Soviet Union, but they also had a good network of spies in the United States, especially the Manhattan Project during World War II, and they were able to steal quite a few nuclear secrets. And beyond that, it's also the context of the Korean War, which was not going too well. You remember from the last lecture that the Korean War was a long, indecisive conflict that ended in kind of a stalemate. So people often wondering, how come we're not winning the Korean War? How can we defeat those North Koreans and those Chinese? Again, the ready-made answer. There are traitors in the State Department, maybe even the US Army. So it gave voice to a lot of concern that were present in Cold War America, so he gave the wrong answers to that. Beyond that, there are a lot of spying scandals in the United States during the early 50s and late 40s. Again, he didn't uncover any of those, but those scandals happened at the same time, uncovered by others, and so that gave credence to a lot of these wilder claims. Let's look through three of the more famous cases. One of them would involve Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were a couple where, specifically he, would have been a nuclear scientist in the Manhattan Project. Kind of a low-level one, but he was a communist sympathizer, and he had been a spy for the Soviet Union. She was not a scientist, but she was a fellow sympathizer of the Soviet Union. So when it was revealed that he was a spy, even a low-level one, he was put on trial, convicted as a spy, and it's pretty rare for people to be killed for espionage. Usually they're deported, but in his case he was sentenced to death. Even more strange, she was sentenced as well, even though she was not a scientist, she was not a spy, but she was seen as an accomplice. And there were some pleas for mercy, especially since they had two young boys who would have been orphaned if the parents were executed, but those pleas fell on deaf ear, and both of them were sent to the electric chair. In addition, the fact that the Rosenbergs were Jewish were treated far more harshly than other spies who were Gentiles has led to accusations that anti-Semitism might have been the cause for the harsh sentence rendered unto them. The other person that you see here, Klaus Fuchs, was also a spy and a much more important one, so he got off more lightly. And make sure to spell his name Fuchs. I've encountered a lot of students who mischievously misspell his last name for some reason. He was a German-American, also a nuclear physicist, also involved in the Manhattan Project. In his case, that passed on information to the Soviets that was of much higher level, and he was helping them speed up their nuclear bomb project, and that's why they exploded the bomb in 1949. He was also uncovered and also sentenced for espionage, or in his case, not sentenced to death. He got off with just a prison sentence. The last person had a slightly different story. Aldred Hiss was in the State Department, the branch of the government that handles foreign affairs, and he had been a fellow member of the Communist Party, at least in the past, which by itself is not a crime. You have the right to be a member of whatever party you want. But what happened is that in the late 40s, he was asked whether he had ever been a communist in the past, and he lied about it under oath. And the lying, the cover-up, was what got him. The case was a complicated one. It was followed in the papers a lot. At some point, some of the key evidence was hidden in a pumpkin patch, of all places. So it's great material for the press, but eventually he was sentenced to prison for lying under oath. So you have all these stories of actual spies floating around, and since McCarthy is also claiming to have evidence of other spies, people are buying this, and that's why people were willing to oversee some of the more unsavory aspects of his character. Eventually he flew high for a couple years, and then by 1953-54, when the Korean War ended, the context was a bit less favorable, and people started to turn against him. Specifically, instead of targeting the State Department, which is an institution that few Americans know about or care about because, well, I don't think you know a diplomat in your immediate entourage, he decided to shift targets and attack the US Army, which by that point was a much more popular institution. They had World War II, they have fought bravely in Korea, and you have a lot of servicemen lying around, so many people like the US Army. And he invited an American Army officer to answer charges of espionage and disloyalty to his committee, and that Army officer conducted himself with great dignity and really provided a great contrast between him acting like a good gentleman and McCarthy acting like a bully. To make things worse, McCarthy had invited the TV to his hearings, and that's the beginning of a TV era, so TV will play a lot of role in the politics from now on. And he thought it would help him, but in fact he just put his personality on display, unfiltered, right there for people to see the whole bullying, the lying and changing his opinion and interrupting witnesses, including that dignified American officer who eventually uttered the famous words that kind of summarized the whole business. Senator McCarthy, at long last, do you have no sense of dignity at all? So by that point, sensing that there was blood in the water, the other fellow senators, who before that had been kind of hiding for fear of being attacked by him, finally summoned enough courage to pass a vote of censure. And censure doesn't really have any legal value. It just means that the rest of the Senate will shun you. You are no longer invited to the cool kids table. After that, he was shunned by his fellow senators, ignored by the media, and as it turned out, he always had a drinking problem, which got worse, and he eventually died just a few years later of alcohol-related problems. And that was a sad end for a man who, for a while, even though he was not president, had kind of dominated American politics and even scared Eisenhower. The man who had organized the D-Day operation in Normandy was scared only by one man in his life, and that was Joe McCarthy. When people cover the anti-communist period in the 1950s, they tend to focus on McCarthy alone, when in reality he was just the tip of the iceberg. You have a lot of people who buy into his series, and it's just not just him. It's a McCarthy era where you have a lot of fellow anti-communists out there. For one thing, when we had talked about the aftermath of World War I in the beginning of the 20s, I had mentioned the first Red Scare, where back then, right after the Soviet Union became communist, people were afraid that there were a lot of communist terrorists acting in Washington, D.C., and there had been already a persecution of communists back then. So there's a long tradition of anti-communism in the United States, which is understandable since the principles of Marxism and communism are so alien to more the American traditions of free market democracy. And the anti-communist Red Scare of the 1950s was not just in the Senate and in McCarthy. You also have a House Committee on Un-American Activities called HUAC, where in the House of Representatives, people are doing pretty much the same thing, summoning people, issuing subpoenas, and accusing people of being communist. They were especially active in trying to root out communists from Hollywood. And now it's kind of easy to understand why you don't want communists to be the physicists in the Manhattan Project to develop a nuclear bomb, because they could be kind of dangerous spies for the Soviet Union. But Hollywood is not quite as clear. After all, who cares if the plot of the next I Love Lucy episode is being revealed to the Soviets, right? Well, the idea was that Hollywood shapes a lot of minds because people love the actors, they go to the movies and they absorb the storylines, and they might act in a way that is more communist if you have secret plot lines in the movies that are kind of making, I don't know, capitalists look bad, or the US government look bad. At any rate, there was a movement in the late 40s and early 50s to kind of root out communism from Hollywood, and that meant that if you were a communist or accused of being one, then you could not work in Hollywood, period. And that was called the Blacklist. You were blacklisted. And just like McCarthy used and abused accusations of communist infiltration to pursue his political career, you have some actors that used and abused that in Hollywood as well. If you were an actress that was not too successful and somebody else had gotten the job in a movie, well, the best thing to do was to slip a note to the producer of the movie to accuse the top actress of having been a communist sympathizer, and then she would lose her job, and that would open up a slot for yourself to now slip into the #1 role. So a lot of careers were ruined in that way by false or true accusations of being a communist sympathizer. Beyond McCarthy, you have quite a few people who believe in wild communist conspiracy theories. There are people that are convinced in the 1950s that Eisenhower, of all people, might be a communist spy. Or the fact that people are putting fluoride in the water, which normally is to fight against cavities, that might be part of a giant communist plot. In fact, if you watch Dr. Strangelove, which is one of my favorite movies, one general in there is a crazy guy who's saying that the fluoridation of water is a communist conspiracy. And that sounds crazy in the movie, but in reality it was based on a widely held belief by a very far-right group called the John Birch Society. So McCarthy is not alone out there in making all these crazy claims. Beyond Hollywood, another area where people are very concerned about would be schools and universities, where there's also a witch hunt to weed out all communists or sympathizers or pinkos from teaching at universities or schools. And again, that doesn't seem like a very big national security threat. You know, if I were a communist sympathizer, I'm not, but if I were, what kind of threat do I present? I'm going to leak out the topic of the next quiz to Moscow. I mean, what am I going to do with that, like that? Well, the rationale behind weeding out communists from schools and thus denying those teachers a choice of party and basic civil rights would be that just like actors and producers, they kind of mold the mind of people. And you might not realize it, but when I'm talking to you, it's like your brains are clay in my hands. And by fashioning the past, I also fashion your brain and make you believe the past the way I see it and push you into the direction of one party or the other. So there was a big witch hunt, and that has nothing to do with McCarthy, to weed out communists throughout schools and universities in the 1950s. Which some abuses again. Let's say you are a student and you don't like that teacher because that teacher gave you an F. All you have to do is call the high school principal or the head of the history department at McNeese State University and tell them that I don't like this professor and I think he is a communist sympathizer, and that would be enough to get that person fired. So quite a few careers were derailed or ruined because of such baseless accusations. Let me end today with yet another Republican senator who is very anti-communist, but that's not McCarthy, and that would be Richard Milhous Nixon, who was originally a Republican from California. And in the late 40s, when he was running for congressman for the first time, at the very end of an uphill campaign, some anonymous flyers started to appear accusing his opponent, the Democrat, of being maybe pinkish or a socialist or even a communist sympathizer. These flyers were undocumented, unsigned, but they were enough to push Nixon over the top. During the Cold War, people don't want to take any chances and they vote for the other guy, and that's how Richard Nixon launched his campaign, his career in politics, and became a representative. A couple years later, he ran for senator this time, statewide, and California tends to be a rather democratic or liberal-leaning state, so it was an uphill battle. And he was running as an incumbent that was quite popular, Kirk Douglas, I think was her name. At any rate, lo and behold, a couple weeks before the election, anonymous flyers all over California accusing Miss Douglas, who was a Democrat, of being very pink or even red and a closet communist sympathizer. And the good people of California decided instead to vote for Richard Nixon, who then went on to become senator from California. And then in the 1950s, he was picked as the vice presidential running mate by Dwight Eisenhower. So he was vice president for a while, and then finally achieved his full dream in '68 of being president of the United States, and eventually resigning in disgrace after the Watergate scandal. We'll get to him again when we get to the 1970s. So Nixon would be another good example of a politician using and abusing the communist menace, which is real, to further his political career. He was known for good reason as Dirty Dick or Tricky Dick, his first name being Richard, which puts him on a par with a different president, a Democrat this time, William Jefferson Clinton, who was nicknamed Slick Willie in the 1990s. Well, if I am making double entendre, it might be a sign that it's time to close up for today. Before I sign off, I would like to mention one great movie which on the surface has nothing to do with the McCarthy era. That movie is Spartacus, which is set in the days of Republican Rome. It's about the slave revolt. It actually has a connection to the McCarthy era because the person who wrote the screenplay was a person who was blacklisted as a communist. And if you pay close attention to the movie, you'll notice that there's a bit of a communist undertone. It is about slaves revolting against the oppressive class. It also has a lot of homosexual undertones, but that's another story. The person who starred in that movie and also produced it was the son of a Jewish immigrant named Esau Danielovich Dembski. You know him better as Kirk Douglas. And Kirk Douglas insisted that the person who wrote the screenplay should be credited for his work, and the fact that his name appeared in the credits meant that this movie broke the blacklist. And from that point forward, people that were communist or any other political affiliation could be employed in Hollywood. That movie is also notable because aside from Kirk Douglas, my favorite actor, it has my favorite director in it, Stanley Kubrick, and it is about my favorite historical character, Spartacus, so it's all good. And just on top of that, you have some great actors like Laurence Olivier and Peter Ustinov and many, many others. And I forgot Tony Curtis as well, he's in there. So that's it for today. You now can watch The Manchurian Candidate and Dr. Strangelove and Spartacus between now and the next lecture. Goodbye, au revoir.